Hello and welcome to another episode of Climate Uncertainty, Mitigation, and Adaptation. So what are you going to do? In which we use the Culhane relational summary method to react and comment on current events and relate them to our lives and the literature to see what we can do to make a difference. Today I'm reacting to the articles How Bill Gates Aims to Clean Up the Planet from The Guardian, February 4th, 2018, and Keeping the World Below 2 Degrees C of Warming Needs Tech We Don't Have from Ars Technica on February 5th. And I've brought a cartoon expert into the studio to tell us what the articles say so that I can react to them as an example of artificial, if not fake news. Greetings, cartoon expert. The premise of the first article is that we now have enough experience with carbon capture and sequestration technologies that if we scale it up appropriately and effectively, we could remove enough CO2 from the atmosphere to keep us below the 2-degree warming threshold, right? Go ahead and tell us what the article says.
The idea is grandiose yet simple: decarbonize the global economy by extracting global warming carbon dioxide, CO2, straight from the air, using arrays of giant fans, and patent a chemical wizardry, and then use the gas to make clean, carbon-neutral synthetic diesel and petrol to drive the world's ships, planes and trucks. The hope is that the combination of direct air capture, DAC, water electrolysis and fuel synthesis used to produce liquid hydrocarbon fuels can be made to work at a global scale, for little more than it costs to extract and sell fossil fuel today. This would revolutionize the world's transport industry, which emits nearly 1/3 of total climate-changing emissions. It would be the equivalent of mechanizing photosynthesis. The individual technologies may not be new, but their combination at an industrial scale would be groundbreaking.
Sounds promising. But of course, as climate scientists Kevin Anderson and Glenn Peters in Europe state in a recent article in the journal Science, these technologies do represent a moral hazard par excellence, don't they? They encourage a mentality of business as usual for the polluters and emitters with the excuse that technology is coming to the rescue to clean up our mess. Kind of like the cat in the hat comes back. The article points out, as I read it, that critics feel the whole thing is unfeasible when it would be better to keep thing 1 and thing 2 from messing up the house in the first place. But the Greek word for house is oikos, from which we get ecosystem and economy. They say, well, what do they say?
They say not using the fossil fuel and not producing the emissions in the first place would be much cleverer than having to find end-of-pipe solutions.
Right. The second article is even more pessimistic and shows the following graph that calls into question the idea that even if we did a massive scale-up of CCS, carbon capture and storage, that these technologies most likely will never get there in time, particularly as we continue to obliterate the natural and most effective forms of CCS, forests and soils and wetlands and mangroves and coral reefs. As long as land use change and water system degradation is occurring, as long as we're continuing to do the kind of agriculture and fishing and habitat destruction we're engaged in, we are fighting a losing battle. The article concludes that of all the technologies we have, including reforestation and accumulating carbon through soil building practices, and the current reinjection of carbon into old oil wells, quote, none is on track at this point, end quote, to make much of a difference. What are the salient quotes from the second article that you picked out?
The ESAC report's conclusions are basically twofold. We have to develop carbon dioxide removal schemes more aggressively, but we also have to cut our emissions enough that we don't rely on those schemes to save us. Things like biofuels and industrial capture plants rely on the existence of underground storage infrastructure, which is also behind schedule. Some projects are already operating, but most are just injecting gas into oil fields to keep the crude flowing. It's not so much that we haven't figured out how to do things like biofuels. There just isn't enough on a financial incentive to do them in the absence of significant fees assessed on emissions.
Well, that's it, isn't it? And that's one of the conclusions of the article with the rosier title, too. What do they say?
By the middle of the century, many of the models assume as much removal of CO2 from the atmosphere by negative emission technologies as is absorbed naturally today by all of the world's oceans and plants combined. They are not an insurance policy. They are a high-risk gamble with tomorrow's generations, particularly those living poor and climatically vulnerable communities, set to pay the price if our high-stakes bet fails to deliver as promised.
Yeah, according to Anderson, the beguiling appeal of relying on future negative emission technologies is that they delay the need for stringent and politically challenging policies today. The article says they pass the buck for reducing carbon on to future generations. And then it goes on to say, but if these Dr. Strangelove technologies fail to deliver at the planetary scale envisaged, our own children will be forced to endure the consequences of rapidly rising temperatures and a highly unstable climate. Wow, that is sobering, isn't it? See, I believe technology to the rescue is a kind of deus ex machina that we can ill afford to rely on. You do know what deus ex machina is, don't you?
It is defined as 1. In ancient Greek and Roman drama, a god introduced into a play to resolve the entanglements of the plot. And 2. Any artificial or improbable device resolving the difficulties of the plot.
Yep. Remarkably, we've put ourselves into a situation where both the religious fanatics and the technocrats are pushing policy toward this ancient cheat, this ridiculous and lazy technique that dramatists relied on when they'd done a really bad job at writing their plays. Audiences tend to hate it and boo when a story gets so messed up the author has to pull a deus ex machina moment to create the happy ending, and you should hate it and boo even louder when the drama involves your own fate. I personally don't want my life to be a stupid comedy or a horrible tragedy, so I favor a better device for resolving the entanglements of the climate change plot. Rather than these macroeconomic megatech solutions, I favor decentralized small-scale technologies which, used in the aggregate, add up to huge impacts. We're still caught in the "in a world" narrative where one man, in this case Bill Gates or Trump or some other billionaire, can legislate or buy and implement a massive solution. When you think about it, since many of the problems of environmental degradation and climate change came about by microeconomic actions of individuals and families and communities and businesses and firms using badly made technologies that were inefficient, that deforested and degraded land and sea, polluted and spewed carbon into the atmosphere and hydrocarbon materials into our land and water, they can also be tackled by the actions of individuals using better technologies and techniques that are carbon neutral or even carbon negative. Plant a damn tree, eat paleo, use and promote permaculture, go solar, etc., etc.
The articles both conclude that the sheer cost of the macroeconomic solution technologies make them unlikely to come online in time. But there are other low-cost and ubiquitously available technologies that we desperately need to employ immediately and get everybody to use. We've talked about the technologies for better creation and dissemination of knowledge and education, like the ones we are using here, with animation and video production and social media, to end the reign of the textbook and media companies controlling our discourse.
The other is individualized data collection and data visualization. And that is why, in today's module, I want to introduce you to the inexpensive Arduino microcontroller and Raspberry Pi computer and their digital analogs, and how to use them with environmental sensors and data display technologies like spreadsheets and statistics packages and geographical information systems, GIS, and mapping, so that we can all do citizen science and all contribute to the real-world empirical research being done so that we know what is real news and what is fake news. Why should we even be having debates about whether climate change is real, whether scientists are telling the truth or lying, whether we can trust the weatherman or whether the graphs are lying? I know British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, made famous by Mark Twain, quipped, "There are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics." But this oft-quoted piece of dark humor can only ring true when the statistics are firmly clenched in the hands of the power elites.
Statistics themselves don't lie. Data doesn't lie. Only the interpretation of the data and the statistics generated from it can be made to lie.
That's why when I talked in the last module about the advantages of crowdsourcing and Bitcoin and blockchain technologies and the wisdom of crowds in the absence of bad leadership, I told you I was feeling very hopeful indeed.
But for these peer-to-peer, many-to-many citizen science efforts and technologies to have impact, we need as many participants as possible.
It now becomes a civic duty for each of you who claims to want to be a change agent to start getting familiar with the tools that undergird our citizen science, our crowdsourcing effort. You have to become a node in the multiple Nexus system, a link in the evolving blockchain, where all data and all stories and opinions are recorded and verified and pooled and made useful, where, to quote Goldman Sachs' website,
the openness of the internet with the security of cryptography gives everyone a faster, safer way to verify key information and establish trust.
Yep. It is the belief of many of us that when every citizen is monitoring and reporting on the extreme changes occurring in the weather and their effects on our daily lives and plans and dreams, when each of us is contributing data on temperature and electroconductivity and pH and fertility and the health and toxicity of our soil and water and the presence or absence of wildlife and indicator species, and helping to build the big picture, then the tools of big data in the petabyte era can aggregate and make sense of all the small data which each contributes in a meaningful way. With our ability to now use distributed ledgers that replicate append-only data structures, growing ever larger in the cloud and available to all, with attribution of each record in the evolving database to those contributing, so we know who said what. We will be able to form an ever more faithful model of what is happening in the real world, and when we try out certain policy maneuvers or on-the-ground experiments, we can all start seeing the results and change or adjust our course when necessary, before it's too late. It's my belief that keeping the world below 2 degrees C of warming actually needs tech we do have. Open source, low-cost citizen science tech that is available to everybody right now. The real question is, will you embrace it in time?